we think about the world in terms of profit pools. That's like part of the vernacular we use internally. And you realize that there's some really interesting pockets of profit pools that have been under innovated in over the
Mhm.
last decade, over the last 2 decades. And we think that there's a real opportunity for entrepreneurs and for venture capital to innovate in these areas that just haven't been touched upon. When you marry both the concepts of healthcare and the social determinants of health in this population, you're able to turn what was a cost issue into a profit pool. And that's what's really innovative, right? And you don't see many ideas like that. And just making sure the juice is worth the squeeze, right? And if you're going to go through a 9-12 month sales process, making sure you have a price point that is high enough that
Mhm.
covers the cost from a CAC perspective so that you are making enough gross margin to make it worth the while. We've really spent a lot of time thinking about the consumer, the role that they play in their own health, both from a navigation perspective, preventative health perspective, diagnosis, and treatment.
Welcome to the Smart Venture Podcast. We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the Silicon Valley, where unicorns roam and innovation never sleeps. We've got top investors, superstar founders, and well-known tech executives lined up to share their secrets on building and investing in successful companies. Just a quick disclaimer, while we may sound like financial geniuses, but please don't mistake us for your friendly neighborhood financial advisors. So let's get started and dive into the wild world of tech entrepreneurship. Hi, Amber. Thank you so much for coming on the Smart Venture Podcast today.
So happy to be here, Grace.
Awesome. So before we get to talk about your white papers, let's start with, I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit more. So to give the audience a little bit background of you, you started your career as an intern at American Express and you have worked in consulting at Bain, BCG, and nonprofits. And then you were the assistant to the CEO of Mid Clinic. And at Bessemer, you invested 7 companies, either IPO'd or got acquired. You are on the board of HIMSS and among other health tech companies, and you also invest in Mosaic ML, which is acquired by Databricks for $1.3 billion. And to start the show, I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit from your own perspective. What are something that kind of impacted you early on in your career that shaped you into who you are today?
Of course. Well, thanks for that great intro. I really, really appreciate it. Yeah, I think when taking a step back, I mean, a lot of my life, and I think all of our lives from a professional perspective are intertwined with our personal lives and in how we grew up. And so for me, I'm the son of first generation immigrants from India. My parents came here from Calcutta. They met in the US, and my dad's a physician. He did his when you switch countries when you're a doctor, you have to redo your residency and your training. So he went to Howard University and redid everything. And so I was born in DC, and we spent some time living in that city. And then the rest of my childhood, for the most part, was growing up in rural America. As an immigrant physician, you kind of move around to wherever there's lack of access for healthcare. And so we moved to rural West Virginia, rural California. And a lot of those times were really formative for me because my he's a solo practice neurologist, still practices to this day. But it was our own little family business, right? My mom used to work there every day as the admin. My sister and I would come after school. We'd put the files away in the filing cabinet. We'd help them do the dictations and the billings, like all those things. We kind of just became ingrained in us. And he's also an entrepreneur, right? He was,
Mhm.
starting his own thing, taking a huge risk coming across the world. And we eventually moved to the Bay Area, for junior high and high school. And that was such a culture shock, for us, our whole family, and me in particular. And it happened to coincide with the dot-com boom, right? So this was in the late 90s. And growing up in kind of the rural world, and then coming into, Silicon Valley, where I'll never forget, our high school parking lot, between my
Mhm.
freshman year and my senior year, the types of cars that were being driven in the high school parking lot dramatically changed during that time. So, it was really neat. And I think a lot of like my future career, all those stops that you mentioned along the way, there's some function of, growing up in a physician household, helping run that practice, and also some part of understanding what it's like being in small town America. which is, most of my youth, and also then being exposed to just a mass amount of innovation in pretty formative, years in my adolescence. So that's really kind of what brings it all together.
Totally. I love that. And then I also like I remember like when we chat last time you mentioned about like you skip a couple grades. What was that like for you and how does that give you an edge when it comes to, building a career in investing?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I grew up in a couple small towns, as I mentioned, West Virginia and California, and I learned how to read and do math at home, right? This is something that was really, just intuitive to me. And I think I took early to numbers and a lot of things like that. And so I was able to, progress really fast in school, but really unexpectedly. I didn't really know this concept. One of my favorite stories is I remember in second grade, I would just go to class every day. And maybe for some of your older listeners, there was a computer game that existed called Oregon Trail, where back in the 90s, this was a thing everyone played, and you basically just would be responsible for making a certain set of decisions to go as an explorer through Oregon and go from the East Coast to the West Coast to discover gold and all that stuff. But anyways, in second grade, every day I'd finish like the math tables or whatever in like 5 minutes, and I'd spend the rest of the class just playing Oregon Trail for months. Like that's all I do at school is play Oregon Trail. So eventually, like the principal and the teacher called me, to the office with my parents, and we had like this big, this this big meeting, and my parents were just, so worried that I had done something wrong or whatnot. And so then the principal asked me, she told my parents, she's like, "Hey, do you know what your son has been doing in school every day?" And they're like, "No, tell us." And then they were, there was almost like a got you moment. And then he's like, "He's been playing a lot of computer games." And I'm like sitting there terrified. I'm like, "The teacher lets me." And they're like, "We only have one question for your son." And they're like, my parents are like staring at me and the principal's staring at me. And the principal asked me, "Can you tell me how you spell your last name?" And as you might know, my last name is very long. It's Bhattacharya. It's 13 letters. And after I was able to spell a 13-letter word, she's like, "Well, clearly you're smarter than the average second grader, so you can get promoted to third grade." And so those were kind of the bars, to go from like to skip a grade. As you mentioned, I skipped a couple of grades growing up. And at that point in time, it was fine. But as life went on, when you're the youngest person in your high school, youngest person in your college class, you have to work a lot harder to keep up both, academically, sports wise, and socially. And for me, it just maybe had a huge chip on my shoulder. Every single place I went, I felt like I had to prove that I belonged. I had to prove it from, in sports, just make sure I ran harder, jumped harder, shot better, practiced more, and, socially make sure I was, trying to do what I can to, to be a leader in whatever social situations I could. And then academically, just like work really hard, try really hard to get these opportunities, here, because I knew nothing would be handed to me, because in my mind, I was like, I'm the youngest kid. I have the most, everyone else has one more year, 2 more years on me. I got to prove it. And so that still drives me a lot to this day, even though, you know, those situations are far behind me. That's a lot of that intrinsic drive.
Wow, totally. I feel like, being forced to like kind of proving yourself all the time, it definitely gives you an edge to kind of like work harder or work smarter. And so I'm curious, like since you mentioned like, you skip a couple grades and then like you overall you have a pretty good career track record. I wonder like who is on your personal board of advisors, especially in venture. It's such a mentorship driven industry. I wonder like, how did you get involved and like how did you, like quickly succeed in the industry?
Yeah, for me, the way I got into venture, perhaps like many others, is I worked at a startup, Minute Clinic, that ended up being acquired by CPS. But Minute Clinic was backed by a few venture capital funds. The lead investor was Bain Capital Ventures. And if you actually rewind the clock there, so I became very close to the folks at Bain Capital Ventures. I ended up working there, of course, for a couple of years afterwards. But some of those folks that I met back then still remain mentors to this day. Jeff Chrisan he was an observer on the board of Minute Clinic. He was at Bain Cap Ventures, and now he runs his own fund, Silversmith. But he's a close mentor. And if you go back to that era, Minute Clinic, we had a few options, financing wise, but one of the options we had was from another fund called Highland Capital Partners, and I got to meet the one of the folks there who was much earlier in his career. This guy, his name is Bijan, and I met him in that context when I was an operator, he was an investor, but then we ended up collaborating a few times in the venture world, and he remains a mentor to this day. And I think like a lot of those kind of 15-year plus relationships where, they knew me when I was, an operator, saw me early in my career in venture. I mean, obviously I worked for Jeff and those guys, for a bit. They really shaped a lot of how I think about the world, how I treat entrepreneurs or try to treat founders, how to think about the business side of this job, which is sometimes glamorous, most of the time not. And so I think a lot of that is there. And then as time goes on, I try every stop along the way, I try to pick up a different mentor at Bessemer Venture Partners. The person who hired me is someone named Chris Gabrielli, and he was a partner at Bessemer starting in the 80s, and just is a truly phenomenal mentor to me. And he was an operator before too, and showed me a lot of the ropes and helped me understand both the healthcare side of the world. He's very passionate about education, so understanding the ed tech side of the world when that was an area that I focused on a decade ago. And I think all these folks still remain very close to me today. And that's how whenever there's a tough decision or a tough situation, I try to make sure I don't hesitate to ask, but also make sure whenever we're in the same city, make sure we sit down and catch up and just, stay close.
Totally. I wonder after, working with these great mentors as well as like you have invested in a lot of really great companies. I wonder, what do you identify as like one skill that will help you succeed in venture or entrepreneurship?
I think it's grit. I mean, that's the one thing I've seen in common. Everything's a roller
Mhm.
coaster, right? I mean, whether you're on the investing side or whether you're on the startup side, you have good days and bad days. And the bad days are just really low, right? I mean, they can be really, really low, and you can have a sequence of them in a row, and when it's high, you can get really, really high too. So I think that grit is the number one thing that I've seen where people just are able to grind through the early stages of a venture, get it from 0 to 1. That's what I'd rank highest.
Totally. Let's talk about healthcare. Besides, coming from a family of physician and being really immersed in that kind of environment growing up, we chat about healthcare is a sector that isn't really just like coming into waves like crypto, AI, or every couple of years there's a new wave of something. Healthcare doesn't come in trend. Healthcare is a sector that really needed the tech innovation to help them to making a major change in the entire industry. You mentioned about Bessemer where you worked at. They had a report, they had a white paper, and basically one of the major point was technological innovation in healthcare hits an inflection point around 2010, and the response to two major US policies. That was a major change back in maybe 10, 15 years ago. I wonder what is the equivalent of today? What are some other major trends that's happening to make this sector really interesting for investments?
Yeah. I think there's a few questions you asked in there, so I'll do my best to try to address them. So one is why healthcare? There's a few things that are really appealing about healthcare, both from a business perspective and a mission perspective. Let's start with the business side first. So one is it is such a large percentage of GDP. And in the US, certainly, but even internationally, and it is, it is it's a global problem. A lot of our companies, by the way, have global reach, and we think that's one of the benefits of trying to build at scale. But let's focus on the U.S. There's somewhere between 15 and 20% of GDP now is the healthcare sector. It is one of the largest sectors out there. So then you take the next step of, okay, what drives that GDP? Is it interest rates? Is it inflation? Is it et cetera? Is it something else? And for the most part, it's not completely true, but for the most part, it's relatively uncorrelated to those things.
Mhm.
It's the aging of the population, right? It is the growth of chronic diseases. It is the advent of precision medicine. These are things that in any economy, whether low interest rate, high interest rate, GDP up, GDP down, these are just trends, right? People get older and people get more diseases. Kids are born, kids need help. These are just things that keep going. And we like that ability to be recession resilient and semi uncorrelated to some of those other macro trends that are happening. I think the third thing that's interesting is that, a lot of people will cite healthcare being a $4 trillion industry, and I think that's right. But the other thing that we really like about it is you can segment it really well. And once you start segmenting it down, you realize that there's, we think about the world in terms of profit pools. That's like part of the vernacular we use internally. And you realize that there's some really interesting pockets of profit pools that have been under innovated in over the last decade, over the last 2 decades. And we think that there's a real opportunity for entrepreneurs and for venture capital to innovate in these areas that just haven't been touched upon. And we think that's like just really exciting also, right? And so those are kind of like 3 kind of big macro factors. Now, the second part of your question is, what are the catalysts, right? For change. And so when I joined Bessemer, it was in 2010. It was right after those 2, seminal pieces of legislation passed that catalyzed the last decade of growth in healthcare innovation. One was the HITECH Act, which provided a lot of subsidies for electronic medical records. In short, government basically wanted to prime the pump for health systems and physician practices to adopt electronic medical records. Believe it or not, 15 years ago, it was mostly pen and paper, even in large like hospitals. And that was a huge move by the government to modernize everything. That's kind of the first one. And the second one was the Affordable Care Act. And this one it did a lot of things, but one of the things it did was it created an exchange, and it created the individual exchange. It created a whole bunch of other opportunities that are derivatives of that. But when you zoom out, actually, what it really did was it was like a flagpole for entrepreneurs saying healthcare has dollars in it, and there's a lot of innovation, and what you can do is try to change it. And that's really what happened in that over the last decade. And you've seen it. I mean, tens of billions of dollars have flown, have kind of come into the sector. Really phenomenal entrepreneurs have come in. And I think people have started building in a lot of these different segments, whether it's the Medicare segment, the Medicaid segment, commercial, individual, underinsured, uninsured. I mean, you go down the list, and I think there's been interesting innovation across the board, much of which we've tried to help foster. But I think that's kind of historically what has happened. I think the third part of your question, then I'll take a breath, is around what are the catalysts today? And I think it's a wonderful question. I think the catalyst can be found in 2 or 3 different forms. And this is one of the reasons why we're excited. One catalyst is still regulatory change. Just a few years ago, there have been interesting pieces of legislation. The 21st Century Cures Act, there's a Pricing Transparency Act. These are pieces of legislation that are forcing payers and providers to behave differently, and pharma companies for that matter. All of these things have changed. With any change, there actually creates opportunity, both for new companies as well as for existing companies to adapt to that. So we have seen a lot of that change. The second thing is there's just so much more data now in healthcare. And you have to go back to that comment of 15 years ago. This was mostly, paper and pen and filing cabinets in the basement of a hospital or a physician office. And today, it's all digitized. Now, there's a huge challenge with that today, is that a lot of that data is structured, a lot of that data is unstructured. There may not be high quality for a lot of that data, but I would say we're still in the early innings of actually turning that data into information and turning it into action. I think we're still really, really early in that process. And that's at the highest level, but you could think about that for any subset of disease. Like, how do you think about that overlaying with cardiology or oncology or pediatrics or right? Just keep going, right? So that's like the second thing. And the third thing is there are a couple of big megatrends today, which I think they are intersecting with healthcare, some directly and some indirectly. that have been huge catalysts for change. Two of the ones that I'll mention, one of them is around AI, right? We'll talk about that, I'm sure, further in this conversation. And that's both predictive AI and generative AI. And we feel extraordinarily bullish about the opportunities for either of those or both those kind of technological breakthroughs to have an impact on healthcare. And we've done some work there already. The second one is more of is things in and around medical innovation. And so another big three letters, that have been popping around in addition to GPT are GLPs, right? That's the other one. And that's like a scientific breakthrough that's, a couple of years old as well. But how is that impacting what healthcare could look like on a 5-10 year basis? How does that help us reimagine what nutrition looks like, what obesity looks like, what diabetes looks like, and maybe a whole bunch of other things? How does it not, right? Like what if medication adherence remains a challenge for those drugs too? But I think it's such a big mega trend that we just have to pay attention. So when you look at those three factors, we end up extraordinarily excited about where the state of healthcare innovation today going forward for the next decade too.
Totally. This is such a comprehensive answer. So like I want to go back to things that you mentioned during this answer. One is you mentioned about profit pools. Can you unpack that a little bit? I've seen some of your like portfolio, including today you're wearing Devoted Health, so which is a healthcare company serving seniors, and then you're on the board of Hims and Hers, which is a modern health and wellness company, and then you invest in City Block Health, which is a tech-driven provider for communities with complex needs. So thinking about these different companies, can you give us an overview on in terms of like the healthcare sector when it comes to profit pools, where does these companies belong, and how do you examine each of these major profit pools in terms of making an investment?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like most of your guests probably wear Gucci or Prada, and I'm here wearing Devoted. So, so that's, we're wearing, living the brand of the company every day.
Love that.
We're very fortunate to be, early partners with Todd and Ed when they were getting Devoted off the ground. So it's the way that we think about profit pools is, I'll give you the technical definition and maybe I'll give you an example. So the profit pools, we define it as is within an industry, how many profit dollars are there that is industry wide in a segment. So let's just take in Medicare Advantage for a second. What you do is say, for all there's X number of people on Medicare Advantage, however many people that is, 40 some million people, and the average profit margin across all of the insurance companies in MA, let's say it's 5 or 10%. And you kind of do the math and see what the overall profits are for the industry. That's kind of like, that's the pool, like the pool of profits, right? You could do the same thing for commercial insurance, for all of hospitals, right? Take their industry-wide average margins of 3 or 5%, multiply by overall hospital revenues, and there you go, right? So that's kind of an example of profit pools. So then what we do is we try to see, how it might apply to any individual company, right? So I'll give you the example of City Block. This is a company that we've been fortunate to be partnered with from the very, very early days when they were being spun out of Alphabet. And I'll give you the anecdote of how they approached the concept of profit pool and how we thought about it as well. So City Block, for those of you who don't know, it's an innovative primary care model focused on the underserved population. So think Medicaid, duals are people who are on both Medicaid and Medicare, folks who are on Medicare, commercial, but really like the underserved. And it's an at-risk model. So what that means is that City Block has a financial incentive to keep these people healthy, right? That is part of it. So changing the conversation from sick care to healthcare, right, is really at the core of what City Block does. And so the way that they explained it, and I'll just use really simple math here, is every time that someone, I'm just going to pick a city, pick a number. Let's just say a City Block is working with a Medicaid member in New York City. Every single time that member ends up going to the ER for whatever reason, they may have some tests, they may get admitted, and they might stay a few days there as they run the tests, things of that sort. On average, let's just say that admission is $10,000. That's going to be the cost of it. So City Block had this really interesting idea of saying like, all right, that's we think about that $10,000 a cost.
Mm.
Let's just say hypothetically, we can contract with an insurance company to say, hey, why don't you pay us $10,000 for this person, and we'll keep them out of the hospital. And any amount of money that we are able to save, we'll split.
Mm.
It's a concept. So then all of a sudden, you kind of flipped it on its head. And the question then becomes, if you had $10,000 to keep Grace out of the ER, what would you do? Like, what's the kitchen sink you would throw at that problem, right? Would you send a clinician to Grace's home? Would you have a social worker call Grace and text her? Would you, if she had food security issues, would you connect her to the food bank? Would you actually have someone pick up the food and deliver it to her fridge? Would you make sure that there was transportation for Grace to go to her doctor's office? Would you actually, if Grace was in the hospital, would you send someone to the hospital upon admission to ask, hey, what's going on? How can we prevent this happening from next time? Could you give Grace a cell phone, to do telemedicine visits if appropriate? There's a host of things you can do if you kind of flip it on its head and think about that $10,000 as like the profit pool and anything, or as a revenue pool. And then you can think about everything else as like what could be, the shared savings, there. And that was really innovative at the time. And I think in that population in of itself is what's unique is that a lot of those things I mentioned were health issues, right? Like when you're in the ER, what can you do to make sure that your diabetes doesn't flare up again? But a lot of those things are social issues, right? The food insecurity, the transportation. City Block helped coin this term, social determinants of health, or maybe someone else coined it, but City Block has ran with it. And when you marry both the concepts of healthcare and the social determinants of health in this population, you're able to turn what was a cost issue into a profit pool. And that's what's really innovative, right? And you don't see many ideas like that. And so hopefully that gives you a real example of how that high level framework kind of turns into like on a unit economic basis, something that we can kind of wrap our heads around. And then you can diligence that, right? By saying, okay, like how does that actually work? What if you did have a kitchen sink of $10,000 you could spend on Grace? What could you do with that? And would that be $10,000? Would it be $12,000? Would it be $6,000? What would it be? And that's kind of how the experiment works.
For sure. I have a question on that. So I really like what you mentioned about like that example. So essentially, from my understanding, the profit pool meaning like it's a problem, and then that kind of like can become a bigger, so like basically associated with a lot of surrounding sectors, that's where like a lot of money are piled up in these different surrounding sectors as well. So I wonder, in terms of that, one of the biggest concern for me as a tiny check writer, angel investor, or whatever, I feel like one of the major concern for investing in the healthcare sector is there's just so much like legal things, or when you mentioned about like, changing in the acts, and like there's a lot of really long sales cycle. So it sounds like I have to convince like many different sector of people to make sure my company that can sell successfully in general. So I wonder, please correct me if that's not the case. How do you view about the long-term sales cycle, as well as like these complex legislation issues around investing in a company in that sector?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's two parts of it that you asked. One is how do you think about the legislation and the regulatory side of it, and then two is how do you think about the sales cycle side of it. On the regulatory side, I think a few things. One is we try to focus on areas where we feel like the regulatory tailwinds are bipartisan as well as sustainable. And I think there's a lot of, and most of healthcare is actually like that. There's very few issues that are really, really decisive between red and blue. I think there's a general acceptance amongst both state and federal legislatures that healthcare costs keep going up. Seniors need more healthcare. Prescription drug prices are high. There's like a lot of just general truths. And I think people may have different ways that they want to solve those issues. And that's okay. Like, I mean, that's, you can have healthy disagreements on those issues. But generally speaking, I feel like there's a lot of common ground and surface area for that. There's a few things that maybe a little bit more controversial here or there, but those tend to be places we don't spend time. And so that's how we think about it. We encourage our companies to stay on top of all the legislation stuff, help
Mhm.
frame it to the extent they can on the state or federal level if they have enough clout. We try to encourage conversations between all the different stakeholders, and government and healthcare is a huge stakeholder. And so certainly that's important. And we try to stay close to the ground on it too, right? I mean, it's, part of our job is to make sure we're listening to what's happening in DC and in the state capitals. And we're also informing that to our portfolio companies and helping shape that in case there's a comment period, and which there generally is for some of these issues. On
Mhm.
the sales cycle side, I think it's a reality of healthcare, and I think of enterprise sales in general. Some of these sales cycles in payers, providers, employers, pharma, they tend to be pretty long, and I think there's no escaping that. And I think one of the root causes for that is they have a lot of stakeholders internally, right, that have to get buy-in.
Mhm.
CFO, CTO, CIO, chief nursing officer, whatever else, right? Like there's just so many people who need to buy into something.
Mhm.
So our pieces of advice there are, one is understanding that that's the case for most things, not all things, but most things, just making sure the juice is worth the squeeze, right? And if you're going to go through a 9-12 month sales process, making sure you have a price point that is high enough that
Mhm.
covers the cost from a CAC perspective, so that you are making enough gross margin to make it worth the while. So that's kind of, point number one.
Mhm.
Point number two is we really like kind of the land and expand motion in these worlds. We've partnered with a lot of companies that have, they increase their share of wallet within an existing customer over the course of time. They have to earn that right, of course.
Mhm.
But we do like that, and we see that a lot in the pharma IT sector, in the employer sector, in particular. I think are places where we've seen that motion. The last thing I'll say is, we also have a very, very positive view on the fifth major stakeholder here in healthcare, which is the consumer. We've been fortunate to partner with folks. I mean, you mentioned Hims and Hers. We partnered since the seed round, but even companies like One Medical, we were early investors
Mhm.
in that.
Oh yeah, I love One Medical.
Yeah, Minute Clinic, obviously, where I came from. One of my
Mhm.
colleagues was at Oscar, and so I think we've really spent a lot of time thinking about the consumer, the role that they play in their own health, both from a navigation perspective, preventative health perspective, diagnosis, and treatment. There's a lot more tools available now than there were 15 years ago, and I think if you look at it on a 15-year basis, there's going to be a whole lot more as well.
Totally. Okay, so let's talk about AI. What is the conversation? It's like in 2023, you don't talk about AI, right? Like so I wonder, so a couple of things there. One thing is like, AI is gonna change the healthcare industry. There's a couple different sector or areas, for example, life science, including drug discovery or like personalized medicine and clinical trials, or like patient facing things, for example, remote patient monitoring, companion AI, and like all these different kind of like new things coming up with the AI trend. So can you give us an overview on how will AI shape the healthcare sector in general?
Yeah. So we currently look at this in three different categories in
Mhm.
terms of how, and we'll focus on generative AI because I think that's the crux of your question. So today, and that this might change in the future, but there's three categories in which we think about it. Category number one is thinking about the infrastructure layer. Like, will
Mm.
there be a healthcare LLM, large language model, that
Mhm.
will be healthcare specific and pervasive for any reason? And I think we've seen it some in academia, right? We've seen,
Mhm.
Gatortron, NYUtron, and a few other folks out of really smart institutions creating healthcare models. You've seen some out of Google, or Alphabet, MedPalm 2 has come out. And you see many companies trying to develop that in the startup world and big company world. And that's all on like the digital health side. There's a whole bio side of this too, which is you think about like the protein language models that have been created, at
Deep mind.
DeepMind and
Mhm.
Meta, a number of startups and labs, academic labs have been working on this too. And so there's a whole host of innovation that is happening on that infrastructure language model layer. that we're excited about and we're spending a ton of time with to understand that. I think category number two is thinking about the application layer. And so a lot of the things that we talked about in our white paper and that 2x2 were different applications, within that we kind of ranked in terms of ease of use and, or ease of development and ease of use. The now the canonical use cases today are note taking, right? Can you actually use generative AI to do better note taking for coding, right? Can you actually take a lot of those, those notes and put them into medical codes and billing codes, things of that sort. But those, we consider that application layer. And I think there'll be a lot of innovation, both for startups and incumbents in that realm. The third category that we're spending time on, and this is a really exciting one for us, are moonshots. And so, and moonshots, these are the things that are generative AI and AI in general enable that couldn't have been possible or even dreamed of 12 to 24 months ago. And this, these are things where you start going into the world of, can you drug something that was previously undruggable? How do you take, Grace's proteomic or genomic data and, generate something, that's either predictive or diagnostic in, for that. When you think about the sum total of medical literature out there, how do you, what do you do with that now that you actually have someone or something to help process that? And how do you do that at a population health level or a group level, for certain countries, for certain ethnicities, for certain genders? You can just really start cutting, slicing, and dicing this data really in ways that were not possible before, and marrying different data sets in ways really efficiently that also couldn't have been done before. Now there's a lot of work to do, right? You have to get layer one to work right, no hallucination, right? Guardrails, all that kind of stuff, of course. But you can start reimagining what the next 1 or 2 decades, maybe 5 decades of healthcare innovation looks like if some of those moonshots actually start to work. And so those are kind of like the high level how we're thinking about it.
Totally. I want to unpack that a little bit. So like you mentioned these three things like infrastructure, application, and then, these moonshot projects. So I wonder, like from an investment perspective, like how much time do you spend on each different subsector? And then in terms of like from deal sourcing to like eventually doing the due diligence, what does that process look like? Can you just walk us through any deal that you've done recently, demonstrate this process of thinking? Give us an example of how you think about these three things in terms of investing, and how do you dedicate your time?
Yeah. For us, we try to think about the world pretty thematically, as perhaps you can tell by now. And a lot of that is looking at these top-down trends, whether it's in generative AI or GLPs or whatever else it might be, and then marrying that with a lot of bottoms-up research. And so there's a lot of secondary research, of course, we do, but the main thing we try to do is talk to as many people as we can. We try to do as many primary research calls as we can. And that helps us inform two things. One is the sales cycles, as you mentioned before, what's being talked about versus what's being bought. Sometimes there's a very, very big gap between them. And we want to make sure we understand that. And the second thing is it helps us understand the problem in a much more granular level from a customer perspective. So I'll give you an example. So over a year ago, we were very interested in the generative AI, space. It seemed like it was going to be a real thing. This is before GPT-3 came out, certainly before GPT-4 came out. And so we as a firm started doing a lot of work to try to understand what was happening. And so as part of that work, one of the things we did was, we called dozens and dozens of customers. I mean, we're talking about 30 plus customers we called that were early adopters of generative AI tools or had considered them and decided not to use them. Right. And this is, again, fall of last year. Right. And so we're doing a lot of this work and slightly ahead of when the megatrend was obvious. Right. It's kind of in that zone. But what we heard were two distinct things from those calls. Like one, it confirmed all the megatrend stuff. Like, hey, this can, it can write us poetry, it can write us letters for our wealth advisors, it can write, all the stuff Doximity did in terms of writing things on behalf of doctors or letters of recommendations for med students, all sorts of stuff, we heard. But we heard two other things that were maybe below the surface that eventually became obvious, but back then it was a little less so. So one is in these conversations, we learned that even for the folks who wanted to use it, getting access to GPUs was very hard, really,
Mm-hmm.
really hard. And so that's kind of point one of what we
Mm-hmm.
heard. And that was, now obvious, but back then we're like, oh, like that's interesting. That's a common refrain. And the second thing that we heard was in and around the models, and there's two types of models that are out there. One are closed source models, I think the OpenAI or Anthropic type models, and then there's a whole bunch of open source models, right? Think about whatever's on Hugging Face, right? The Hugging Face leaderboard is full of open source models. But back then, I would say that there wasn't as much attention being given to the open source side. I think a lot of the attention was focused on the closed source side. And again, this is before Llama 2 came out, right? This is a year ago, right? Where now there's a lot of open source models that are, out there and very prominent. But we kept hearing that if you could get around the black box issue, that'd be really interesting for a certain type of customer. And we kept hearing this a lot from two end markets. One is the healthcare end market, where we have pretty big network,
Mm-hmm.
and then also from the financial services end market, where think large banks and things of that sort. We have where we talked to a lot of folks, and so that led us to think through companies that were helping solve both of these issues. And you mentioned this company Mosaic, that we were lucky enough to partner with, was able to solve both those. I mean, they actually helped get GPU access for customers by having software that worked across the hyperscalers. But two, they also developed their own open source LLM, and they now have many versions of it of different parameter size. And when we did that, and we heard particularly one of their early customers was Stanford Hospital, Stanford Healthcare System, and they were able to use this, and they had actually written this great blog post about how they use Mosaic in the early days to think about to actually make their own GPT, their own, they called it PubMed GPT back in the day, that crawled through all of PubMed, which is the compilation of all the medical publications, PubMed, and to make their own model. That they chose to work with Mosaic, and Mosaic was able to work with them in a span of 6 days, and it only cost them $38,000 to basically do this. And it ended up being a very high quality model at the time. Now
Mm-hmm.
since then, many models have come out. And when we heard about this example and the reasons why systems were using this, it seemed like a way to play the mega trend, but that was more appropriate and more in line with some of our views, right? In terms of, regulated customers would want to have more control over how the model works and what's inside that model. Now you fast forward a year, right? And like a lot of those closed source models do allow a lot more visibility into what's happening there. Even, to OpenAI developer day, they announced even more, more developer visibility into what's happening in those models. So things are changing really rapidly in that world. But I think that's an example of hopefully of that deep diligence, and we heard about Mosaic from customers. That was the first time we heard
Mm-hmm.
about it. Like, is that bottom, like, how do you source these deals? Like, when you hear it from people who are using it, and then we pressure tested that with a bunch of people who weren't using it, that's what led us to be excited about it, and led Mosaic to be excited about partnering with Maverick in that situation. And that turned out to be a really fun venture for all of us.
Totally. I wonder, I really like that you guys mentioned, like, you read about this blog on like Stanford Hospital was using this, which is a really great indicator. And I wonder, like, what does a conversation look like when you were talking to the 30 people in your network? And what type of people do you identify as like someone who will give you like a really important signal? Like, like I have a lot of friends, but like, I don't think if I just go out there and then talk to 30 friends, I would know what I should be investing in the next time. So like, I wonder how does the conversation go, and then how do you identify these, I guess, like key opinion leaders in each space?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the art, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
doing that. And so, some of these entities are very large, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's overlapping responsibility. But generally, it's a year ago, and it's a little bit different today than it was a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few key stakeholders that always came up in the conversations. The CISOs always came up, right? Because this
Mm-hmm.
is, there's a risk, element of this too.
Mm-hmm.
The chief data officer, to the extent that that person existed, would always come up.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes because there was playgrounds, right? OpenAI had a playground, Mosaic had a playground, et cetera. You can actually find a business unit leader, who's doing it. So it actually depends on the organization as to where this would happen. You layer all of those all of that, right, which is down into the who owns the P&L, and we try to supplement that with conversations at the C-suite also. And the C-suite is important in this particular situation because in generative AI, there are a lot of risks, right? Let's just be super clear about that, right? And I think we're in the very early innings of understanding some of those risks, and much less solving them and putting the right guardrails around them. But we have to do that both from a regulatory perspective as well as from a private sector perspective. So you do need CEO buy-in, in order to actually not experiment with it, but actually deploy it. So some combination of those conversations, that is what led to that. And these are, for the most part, our conversations were, Fortune 100 type entities and/or leading health systems and/or leading payers and/or leading pharma companies out there, right? So that's kind of where and how we did our work.
Totally. So are the people you talk to are basically founders in your network, or are they bigger buyers like, the Alphabets of the world? Like, how do you shape that kind of like dynamic of these people that kind of like chipping into the information for you?
Yeah, it's an and both answer. So we try to understand how fast the market is moving through the conversations with the end customers, right? That's always kind of like part one. Part two is we try to understand what the large players are doing from a competitive perspective, right? Because as you mentioned, like the Alphabets of the world, the Microsofts of the world, Amazon, of course, will do something in the space. Like they're all in motion here, right? In the healthcare specific world, one of the biggest potential players in this, and the current player, not potential, is Epic, right? I mean, Epic is the health system of record for the majority of academic medical centers in the US and beyond that, for sure. Really, really dominant player. To understand what they're doing, right? Is important. So you have to marry all of those things with, what is the innovation ecosystem doing? So some of that are founders in our network, or sort of founders in our portfolio. Some of those are founders not in our portfolio. And so we try to do it. And so, one of the examples of things we did, earlier this year is, we held a hackathon in our office, right? And so we brought in, we thought it'd be a pretty small event. We booked out a conference room and it turned out 300 people showed up. And so it's sort of a little bit larger than our conference room can hold. But that was like super exciting for us, where, we did that in collaboration with LangChain, which is, a developer platform to help build generative AI apps. And it was just really phenomenal to see the different use cases there. But that's also how you keep a really good pulse on the market, right? I mean, and that range, the attendees of that range from college kids literally Ubering from their dorm, probably didn't Uber, maybe bus from their dorms, all the way to, folks who worked at unicorns, right? Who are coming in for this kind of stuff. I mean, so it's literally anything and everything, to help kind of drive our perspective on a market.
In terms of like, investing in the next 1 year, like what do you see as something that you're excited about?
I think over the next 1 year period, I think, the mega trends that we're focusing on, I think, and that we've been discussing today are the ones where I think you'll see us focused. So I think we'll continue to be very active in this generative AI meets healthcare space. And I think that is a very fruitful area for us in any of those three buckets, like the moonshots, the application layer, or the infrastructure layer. I think one other mega trend we've been focusing on, as I mentioned before, is around these GLP-1s and what are the derivative effects of that. The way that we define it and the way that we've been thinking about it, and it's very fast moving, right? All these areas are very fast moving, is we think about this kind of more broadly in the nutrition category. How do you think about nutrition? And there's been companies formed over the last 50 years focused on nutrition. And nutrition isn't just weight loss. I think there's people sometimes overlap that. I think nutrition also means, malnourishment at times. It means gut health issues, means women's health issues. There's a lot of things that actually get covered under nutrition. So we're taking a fresh look at that category. And I think we're excited about that, and, the potential to use, medical professionals in combination with drugs, sometimes medical professionals without the drugs, maybe for the people who churn off these drugs, how you actually get them, the help that they need, or maybe even before they actually try a drug, like how do you actually get them to do it? I mean, there's certain analogies out there of, before a back surgery, you should always try physical therapy, right? See if that cures it or helps it. Is there going to be a similar type thing here? So those are the things that we're exploring as maybe two examples.
Totally. Okay, amazing. So where are the 1 minute last fire round questions for you? Okay, number one is, what's your favorite book?
Oh, favorite book. I really like Mountains Beyond Mountains. This was a public health book written about Dr. Paul Farmer, and it's one of those books where I read it, over a decade ago, and it was, to see a human that's so mission oriented to do so much in different settings, it's pretty phenomenal. So I'm a big fan.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Who would I invite to my dinner party? Living,
It's your party.
Yeah, I think amongst the most interesting people today to invite, it's hard not to have Elon on the list. I think he's just a combination of, really, really smart. I mean, he started so many different companies, different areas, but he's also so provocative. I think he'd make for a good dinner conversation. There, I would I'd invite him. I think I'd invite I'm fascinated with public health and issues in and around that realm as well. And so I'd have to go back through kind of the long list of like public health commissioners that we've had in this country. But everything that happened under COVID is interesting to me, right? In terms of how the world worked. And so a Fauci or someone like that would be like pretty interesting to have that conversation. Be curious what he'd do again and what he wouldn't do. And a third is, just in the realm of innovation and kind of leadership. I think, looking back at some of the growth of like traditional companies, is interesting. I think what Indra Nooyi did at Pepsi is really interesting, and she was a great leader for a very long time, Indian American woman. And so being able to, have those three people in that conversation, be a wide range of topics. I don't know, that's what I go with.
Amazing. So who made the biggest impact in your career?
Oh, my parents, for sure. I think they're, watching them, my dad being the solo entrepreneur, my mom kind of supporting them every shape, every step along the way. I think I get my values through them, right? And I think when the going gets tough, you kind of go back to your values, right? And, how do you stay high integrity? How do you stay humble? How do you keep working hard? That's, for sure.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Working on the basketball court. I'm a huge, huge lover of hoops. And so, I love watching hoops, love playing hoops. And so that's where you'll find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amber, for coming on the show today. It was such a wonderful
really fun. Really
awesome.
Fun. Thanks, Grace.
Thanks for tuning into Smart Venture Podcast. If you learned something from the episode or even just mildly tolerated me, please subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. I promise I will keep bringing you more successful, insightful interviews and insider tips about startups. Remember, sharing is caring. So tell your friends to listen too, or enemies, I won't judge. Until next time, keep venturing smartly.